You're listening to the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
The grand deception as matrix is all-encompassing, consuming, and broad-reaching, yet so covert in imposition, it is largely unnoticed by those born into its nurturance. Its programmed assimilation is so subtle, one was never even granted choice to deviate away from its forced indoctrination. Most are raised unknowingly as slaves, incarcerated by its finite machination. Attempting to expose its riddle, we speak truly, if not truthfully, about lost things in lost places with lost words in a lost song. Chronicling it in book, we hope to somehow bring it to be found. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed, and I'm very excited to have as guest with me this evening Gary Wayne. Gary, are you there, brother?
I am. Thank you for having me tonight. So happy to be here.
It's our honor and really a great pleasure to be able to share dialogue with you and fellowship with you in this way. It's been a long time coming, and I've been really looking forward to it. And so I know you've been really doing a lot of shows and covering a lot of this information for the listeners, and you've got a lot of really relevant and really important information all compiled together in this huge compendium that's 816 pages, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary, are you hearing any kind of feedback clicking?
No, I'm not getting any feedback.
Okay, good. Maybe it's just on my side. Hopefully, Kathy, if you would give me a shout out and I want to make sure that the listening audience is not hearing any of that. But for whatever reason, I do hear a little bit of something. But anyways, if you would, can you please tell people where they can go to find your books, your website, contact information, anything that you'd like to share along those lines?
Sure, thanks, Zen. And so, yes, the book is fairly readily available. It's available through Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, Amazon.uk, Amazon.au.com, pretty much any Amazon around the world, BarnesandNoble.com, and through the stores if they want to order it. It's not on the shelf there. Most online bookstores have the book in stock and available. It's also available through Christian bookstores, and if it's not on the shelf there, it is distributed by Send the Light Distribution and Ingram's, so they can easily get the book ordered in. And if they wanted a personalized or autographed copy, they can go to my website, which is www.genesis6conspiracy.com, and go to Buy Now, and then Buy from Author, and fill out the form, and I will send you a book. So book is quite readily available, starting to do quite well, I think. And you can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63 and on Facebook under Gary Wayne, and I have 2 Genesis 6 Conspiracy pages.
Well, excellent. I know there's a lot of people that are interested in your work because of the massive amounts of information that you've collected and gathered all together in a single source. It's quite a remarkable book. I do recommend people read it. I have not yet myself finished it, but I do plan on. Definitely, it's at the top of the list, and so and I appreciate the kind of research that you do because, like myself, I also study truth from all angles and all perspectives, and trying to bring out the underlying connections between all things, like the ancient mysteries and the prophetic word, and also the esoteric aspects of New World Order and the way that the dark side is working, in tangent together through secret societies against humanity and pushing this New World Order. So,
Yeah, I think that's the best way to understand sort of the full context, because even though I weigh everything that I research that's outside the Bible against what it says in the Bible, and measure everything accordingly, I do find that the additional context when you find those correlations just gives you more information and more understanding. So, and in my book, what I try and do is I let sort of, if you want to call it this way, the other side speak for itself. I don't try and twist their words. I let them speak for themselves, and they tell the same sort of history, the same recent history, what they're planning to do and what they want to do to bring about the end time. And it's amazingly consistent with what the Bible says. But what I also try and underline with people is it's not necessarily what I believe that's important. It's what they believe and what they're doing with that information. And that's the key to understanding perspectives from the other side than a monotheistic following or just a very, very strict and stringent biblical following. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about these things, but also for the audience to understand that in terms of what I believe and what I put in the book and how I phrase it in the book is A, I let them talk from their perspective, but B, I weigh everything against what the Bible says, and that is the standard for what I believe.
absolutely, that's the way that I try to relay the information as well, because if people have never heard of how they perceive what they're trying to do and what they're trying to foment as far as New World Order, that's a big piece. And I know that probably you have received criticism for investigating these other esoteric aspects of what's going on in world, especially from those that are KJV only or purists and believe that, delving into some of this other extra biblical material or some of the Masonic lore that is somehow blasphemy.
Yeah, you do get a little bit of that, but if you can just sort of get the person to understand is if you let them tell the story from their perspective, it's a polytheist perspective, and it certainly doesn't have our interest in good order with what they're trying to do and what their history was, but you'll understand what they're trying to do, and it is essentially what the Bible is forewarning us about. But they will tell us everything we need to know because they hide everything, in full view. That we just have to recognize what their language is, what they're saying, and what they're doing, and we can watch it unfold before our own eyes.
Exactly. Which is, for really doing this kind of research, it makes it easy because they aren't. Everything is hidden in plain sight, and they are basically boasting about what they are doing and attempting really to challenge us to stop them. So,
yeah, the hubris is so extraordinary, isn't it? And it's almost like they believe, and maybe to a certain degree they're correct. Is that most people have no idea what they're doing and what they're saying, and there's so few that actually do recognize that they don't really care, and so they feel that they can just do it in plain sight because most of the masses, from their perspective, are mundane, sort of sheeple. I mean, they are people that don't have a deep understanding of their history or real history or the allegories and the imagery and the iconography that they're using. So they can basically do it and laugh in our face, and they can use it to brainwash people as they go, whether it's in education or entertainment or all sorts of different avenues, because it's absolutely everywhere.
right. And then even when people are confronted with the truth, they are so indoctrinated into, like what I was speaking about in the Matrix at the beginning with the poem, that they will fight against any kind of revelation when people like myself or yourself try to bring it to their attention. They don't want to hear it anyways.
They don't. It's easier to remain asleep, although I think once you are awakened, it is better. But, at first sort of understanding of what is going on, I mean, it's a very, very scary thing, and it's kind of like your worst nightmare, and you don't really want to face it. But once you do learn to face it and you understand it, and you also understand that all things are being permitted because God is permitting it, and the end times are ordained, even though it will be difficult and horrific, we can be better prepared and hopefully awaken more people to what is coming, because that's really what, sort of the point of what I'm trying to do is just connect the dots so that people can look for themselves and prepare themselves and people that they know for what is coming, because out of the turmoil and the violence and things that is coming is salvation. So if people can sort of keep their eye on the end goal, then it's worth being awakened from your sleep.
Yeah, I fully agree with that as well. And so let's lay kind of the premise, the foundation for how you got into some of this research and your own awakening. What is it, or what events, what was it that was a catalyst for you in making this kind of information important and interesting, and also that led you, to scurry down the rabbit hole, so to speak?
Yeah, so it was kind of backed my way into it. I mean, I was brought up Baptist when I was young, but by the time I'd gotten into high school and older, I had been totally brainwashed with secular education and peer pressure and everything else that goes on in entertainment, and I'd, walked away from my Christian faith, and actually believed in evolution and all those sorts of things, just like what happens to most people. But I have a brother that in 1981, I think was the year, he asked me to read a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, if I had the courage to read it. And it wasn't that large of a book, and I said, yeah. I said, what's it about? And they started telling me about it, and I'm thinking they're absolutely crazy, because there's no way things like the Antichrist is real, and things like demons, and this is coming out of a period where we had movies like The Exorcist and Omen, and it was really kind of beginning to become popular, that whole sort of concept just afterwards. And then to find out that this is true and there's a lot more to the story, it scared the heck out of me just in that conversation. But I bought the book and I read the book, and I was so impressed with what Hal Lindsey had to say that I bought pretty much all of his books. But most importantly, I started to go into the Bible to try and verify, was he speculating? Was he making it up? Was he taking it out of context? Was he just off on one of these harebrained things that, sounds good, but there's really might not really be anything there. But what I found is the verses and the things that he was saying was there, and he had laid it out in such a good order and so far ahead of his time that I decided I needed to learn more about this, and that started my path back to God and back to Jesus and into the path where I am today. And so between about 1982 and about 1996 or so, I had mapped through every sort of what I would call a stream or a river or a narrative of prophecy into a file and handwritten it, and then I had written it, had typed it, hand typed it into several books, including one on Revelation, where for every verse I went back and had every verse matched up that would support that verse in Revelation, just so I could have everything at the fingertips. And I had created a small story that was for me, and it wasn't for that anybody else could really follow, and it wasn't professional or anything like that. It was just for easy access to this material. And so I thought I could probably write a few books on these things, and there's probably 15 or 20 I'd like to do. And I thought what I would do, though, is I would cut my teeth on what I thought was going to be the easiest, shortest book that I would write. And I thought, just to see whether or not I actually can write, can I get published, why don't I just try and connect these interesting characters in Genesis 6 the end time, because I knew it had prophetic implications based on what Jesus had said about the days of Noah and certain aspects of Revelation with demons in there and the abyss and all those other things. I just wanted to see, could I connect those dots? And I had some of my own biblical research, and then I started to dig into building a story and adding more research. So by about 1996, 97, I was well on my way on that. Well, what happened along the way is every time I asked a critical question or thought I was done, something would come up, another door would open, and just more doors and more doors and more information and more avenues. That what I thought was going to be a very short book was, like I say, going to be the longest book I ever wrote. And I literally had to stop writing because there's so much information out there. It's like, where do you stop on this? And then I took 25% out of the book just to get it to a size that is large, yes, but at least it can be published at that size, even though it's a high-cost project for a publisher. So that's kind of the story as to how I came about writing this book. And as I was journeying through with all this new information, it became clear to me that there's one narrative here. And most writers just write about a small sliver of the subject, and they do a lot of detail on it, but you have all of these different scattered sort of stories that nobody's connected them. So what I tried to do is I tried to connect all of those dots and create one narrative from, basically Genesis 6 and before right through to Revelation, and bring new information to the table in ways that people hadn't thought about, and to challenge people in ways that they would become curious and want to continue to do research on this and build on the platform. And so that's sort of the story about how I came about writing my book.
Yeah, we have similar stories in that regard, because I too, when in just like with Genesis 6 and other things that were very interesting to me in studying the biblical narrative and studying prophecy, I would collect all the different interesting quotes that I had discovered along the way and put them together, compile them, and create outlines with them. And that's what became a lot of my books, especially when I learned that these things that I was discovering were not well spoken of and not written about. And so very similar walks in that regard. Um, and so, can you tell people, like, kind of a generalization of the book? Because, as you said, it's important, in my belief, to know the end and the beginning and how things connect from the beginning to the end. And that there is a story that plays out through the entirety of the canonical narrative, as well as that is interwoven in much of the extra biblical text, and that when you understand how these things align together and parallel one another, that it does present, in my opinion, this war of good and evil, and of these two bloodlines, two races, and even with the harvest, the wheat and the tares, the goat and the sheep, that all of that is all connected in meaning and symbology.
Yeah, so the story basically, it begins in Genesis 6, although it will digress and go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and include the first part of Genesis. But it's about the rise and the creation of the Nephilim and the Nephilim kingships that were created from the sons of God, otherwise known as angels, and the demigods that they created, which were the Nephilim, and the descendants that sprung from the Nephilim, alongside with the descendants of Cain, the partnership with the fallen angels, and the rise of this partnership with the mystical religions and the seven sacred sciences that took the whole antediluvian world to an extraordinary level of technology and corruption, and brought about the first apocalypse by the flood. And then how these organizations and these religions and these bloodlines crossed the flood to begin anew in the post-Diluvian epoch at places like Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah, and how they affected the early post-Diluvian world, how they affected all of our history and manipulated our history, and what they're doing today, what they're planning today, and how they intend about bringing about the end time and the dragon messiah or the antichrist, because all of these organizations have continued throughout our time, have been a significant part of our history, and are still working in partnership today. So that's generally the whole story, is how they began and how they want to bring about this rendezvous with destiny known as the end times, which most people find that hard to believe, but they want to bring this on, and that's why it's going to happen. And God has ordained it, so it will happen.
Yes, well, I know that you study everything and cover all angles, and so let's go back to the beginning, even before here, the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent here on the earth. But can you tell us about your study and anything that you have come across about the war in heaven? And do you kind of see that as the beginning of the contest between good and evil, and what plays out as the two factions, the two different bloodlines here on the earth?
Yeah, and actually devote a chapter 13, which is called Lucifer's Revenge, which sort of addresses that. And so, yeah, my research and what I include in the book is you can't look at our history in a perspective without looking at it and connecting to what happened before our history and in the angelic rebellion. And so if you look at what transpired with about a third of the angels in heaven rebelling with Satan, you have this rebellion that is this whole backdrop to what's going on with our history. And once Adam is created in Genesis 2, and he becomes like a new, improved man that's going to eventually rise above the angels. And so when the fallen angels in particular understand that at some point in time humans are going to be raised above angels, they take offense to it. So now their rebellion now is overlaid onto our history, and what they're trying to do is to prevent in the future world that humans will be raised above angels. And so right in Eden, they are trying to bring humanity down and prevent that from happening, and they are also trying to both enslave and or destroy humankind and lead them away from God so that they don't have an ability to get that inheritance. And so if we want to understand what's going on in the big picture, we have to understand the angels, the hierarchy of the angels, who the key players are and were, what happened before the flood, and how that is still ongoing today.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree. With regard to what I reference as the prior times, do you also ascribe to that when the rebel angels were cast out of the heavens, that they were here previous to the modern creation of humanity, and that when Adam and Eve were created, that they were created in paradise, and that they fell from paradise and were later banished, exiled here to the earth where the rebel angels had previously been already banished to? Or what is your take according to that aspect of the story?
Well, I think yeah, there's a lot of history that happens before Eden, and there's I think there's a lot to the aspect that at some point in time the earth was destroyed or became void, which is one of the possible translations of Genesis 1. and I think it's backed up a little bit in a few other translations. In fact, I know it is, I quoted in the book, that there was a renewal of the earth as opposed to creation there. So there's a period of time where the angels were governing in far off history, and then even before the creation of Adam. And I'll allude to it in my book, but I'm a very strong proponent of a couple of things. One is that A, the Bible is never in contradiction, and two is that the day 6 account of human creation is different than the Eden account, because if you were to go through that point by point, you would see so many contradictions that you just have to either say the Bible either contradicts itself or these are two different stories. And so in that period before Adam is created, there's the reign of the watchers, and depending on which source that you're looking at, there are 3 or 4 ancient civilizations. What is more likely is more like 7 different cultic civilizations that were going on in the Antediluvian epoch, with cities being built even before the Adamites and maybe even before the people of day 6. And so, yeah, I am a strong proponent that these watchers were governors of the earth and governors of probably other areas of the universe as archons and other names that people are familiar with as princes and principalities, but particularly the Seraphim watchers were the ones that were governing over the...
All right, welcome back, everybody. Well, it's really amazing to me, Gary, how similar our work is in the things that we've already talked about, because I also ascribe to the similar type of belief and bring out these premises in my work as well. And in looking at the passages, Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, it becomes clear to me that when you look and use the Strong's Concordance to look up the word tohu, which is without form, the English translation of without form, and also bohu, which is the void, and also the word before haya, which is the earth was without form and void, that there are definitions that speak of that event, well, those two events together, that the earth became a deserted wasteland, a ruinous heap. And so something had led to it becoming that way, and that in fact after Genesis 1:2 we see the reformation, the recreation, and the reconstruction of the earth after it had become this desert wasteland ruinous heap, which in my mind absolutely connects back to the war in heaven. I mean, because what other explanation there, with the angelic rebellion and that whatever events unfolded in connection to that whole scenario, that has had to have been what led to the earth becoming waste, and without form and void. And so, and one other thing in regard to that, um, this also, in my mind, verifies that there was time, a lot of time. How much, I don't know. I can't tell you, but that indeed the angels, the rebel angels, were here and were ruling upon the earth before ever Adam was even created. And yes, there is a difference between what is cited as, in the Genesis 1 creation and the Genesis 2 creation, and that what is referenced in Eden, I connect to as being paradise, and that paradise wasn't on the earth, and that when they were tempted and fell, that they fell from paradise and were then cast out, cast down to the earth where the rebel angels were. Gary?
Yeah, and just I'll finish up on that Eden part as well, but when you talked about Genesis 1, and I talked about, I mean, some translations say now the earth was form, or it could be translated as now the earth became form. So there's two different ways to translate that. And then then it's followed up by, the Spirit is hovering over the waters. And in most of the applications or the verses later on in the Bible, it's talking about how God, laid the platforms and created the earth, and there's these sort of quick references. There's nothing about the Spirit, right, hovering over the waters in the beginning, except when you get into the Psalms 104:30. And what's interesting there, it says, when you send your Spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. May the glory of the Lord endure forever, and may the Lord rejoice in his works. And in there, it's the only one where it says that when you send your Spirit, the face of the earth is renewed. And I think that's significant, that if there was two creations, it was the Spirit that came the second time to renew the face of the earth. And wherever Eden is, we don't know. But what I do know is that it's nobody really knows where it is, and it could be on another planet. I haven't really looked at it at that sort of view before, but what I do know is it was protected by cherubim, which is odd that you would use cherubim on Earth. So I think there's a lot to it that may be in a dimension or a planet or maybe in a location of the Earth. I'll leave that one to you. I've not really spent a lot of time considering that, but what I do know is when we look at these events of the Eden account in day 6, there's just so many things like, and the biggest one, of course, is in day 6 they're created in plural, male and female, and told to multiply. Well, Adam is created in singular, and then later at some point Eve is created, and they're not looking at multiplying until they're outside of Eden. And that's just one of the things that just don't sort of line up. But if you look at Genesis 1 and the day 6 and Eden, you've got two different areas there where there could be significant amounts of time. And certainly, I think between the first, the creation, and the possible renewal, that could be billions of years. And we don't know how long from day 6 to the time Adam was created. But what we do know from other sources is that the gods or the seraphim angels or the watchers of that antediluvian world, they did colonize the day 6 people to do work for them in exchange for food, and they taught them things and partially civilized them and taught them some knowledge so that they could build monuments to worship these gods. But we also know from the Sumerian religions and others that these cities that were built, and again, it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about the Inca with Machu Picchu or any of these great ancient cities, all of these people say, and all of them wrote, that they did not build those great cities. They were built by the gods, and they inherited them, and the same the Sumerian in the Middle East area. And if we look at Jericho, it goes back to being probably the oldest city, at least that they're as far as they're prepared to speculate in science today, which goes back to about 10,000 BC, which is a significant date in history, as you're probably aware of. About 10,500 is the one that most people focus on. And so these cities were built, and then they did harness the blackheads, as they were known in Sumerian mythology, and there were other races. So that, they would have done this all over the world in their various cult centers, because the seraphim angels had these capital cities, and out of there they governed, and they had a temple and a religion and laws, and they would civilize the human beings to do the work for them. And that's sort of what was the early part of the Antediluvian age until it goes sideways big time.
Yeah, I fully agree, which it's fascinating to hear somebody else and having discovered the same kind of thing, because we came from two different perspectives and two different angles, and have been led to the same kind of truth. And I am actually writing right now a book about the differentiation between paradise and the Garden of Eden, and talking, and also all of these things that we're speaking about, how the earth was reformed and recreated, and that's what we're seeing expressed in Genesis with the reformation and the recreation, the reconstruction of the earth. But anyways, I'd like to also get you to talk about the connections between the feathered serpent and the Nakash. Because what we see played out in the biblical narrative is the war between, Revelation 12, the reference of the Nakash as that ancient dragon, that old serpent known as the devil, who basically deceived and beguiled the whole world. And so these beings were here before we were, and like you said, they built cities, and also before the modern creation of Adam and Eve, they had attempted, even in the Sumerian mythology, to enslave the pre-Adamic peoples and to get them to, to worship them, and they did worship them, and then they also institutionalized blood sacrifice and really abominable victim and children sacrifice as part of their religious institutions.
Yes, and just on that last point, and then I'll come back to what you had asked me to talk about, is the knowledge that was provided and the learning and the skills and the arts and the crafts weren't designed to honor the God of the universe. They were provided to humans to find other ways to worship these angels and not give God the respect of creating the universe and not to honor him in any way. So everything that they do with this knowledge is designed to lead them away from God as opposed to back to God, where all the knowledge would have come from in the beginning anyways. So when we talk about the watchers and the fallen angels and the archons, and what I like to call them in the book, the celestial mafia, is a very interesting order of angels, and most of them are seraphim, although Satan is known to be both cherub and seraphim, and I'll sort of explain that as I'm talking about what these seraphims were. And so these were the rulers of the cult centers, and they were also the same order of angels that went to Mount Hermon, and one presumes from other accounts around the world that there was more than just Mount Hermon that was creating these giants. And they cohabitated with human females and created giant demigods. And so this order of seraphims were an interesting looking group. Most people will understand angels as being shining beings, and so these were opalescent beings of the spirit. But they have the ability to take a different type of clothing, as what Corinthians would talk about, the clothing of heaven, or as opposed to the clothing of the earth, that there's a different form that they can take in the physical world, but they're still opalescent, shining beings. And what's important to understand here is they had wings, right? And that's where the feather comes from the feathered serpent thing, or scales, as some other mythologies and religions will look at and picture those at. But particularly the feathered serpent in the North American, the Central American, and the South American mythologies describe, Quetzalcoatl and so many of these other feathered serpent gods. These are the same gods that are in the Bible, and the same gods or fallen angels that are around the Middle East. And what's interesting about the wings and the feathers is that they had the face of a snake or a viper. And so now we see the sort of dragon with wings, where that sort of imagery comes. And we also need to look at the pre-Eden account of what the serpent actually was, because after Eden, the serpent had the legs taken off and the hands taken off and had to crawl on the ground, and they're no longer able to talk and loses its major intelligence. And in other accounts, it talks about that there were more than just these intelligent beings that were the size of a camel, so they're bigger than human beings, that just walking, that they actually had wings. So we have an animal type of dragon flying serpent, which a dragon is, in two accounts. So we have an angelic dragon and we have a animal dragon that happened before Eden. And not only were these, did they have the face of a snake? I'm going to give a few descriptions. And I'm going to go outside the Bible to give this description, and I'll come back to see what I'm talking about in terms of a seraphim. And so if we go to one of the Gnostic Gospels, and I'm sure there's going to be some people out there who cringe at this, but from the origin of the world, they give a nice description of what a seraphim looks like. And that would be long, narrow faces, similar to what you might see from an Akhenaten statue, similar to that, with prominent high cheekbones, elongated jawbones, slanted eyes, and thin lips. And when they put that all together, it had this imagery of a snake. And so how do we know that from a biblical perspective that this is what they're talking about? And I would go to suggest that the word seraphim does not come from the Bible, but its root word does, which is seraph. And we learn about a seraph in Isaiah 6. And a seraph equates these seraphs as snakes, and it refers to these snakes as venomous snakes that we see in Deuteronomy and Numbers that were attacking the Israelites during the Exodus. And so seraphim comes from seraph because the word whether it's Nephilim or seraphim, the word is really just an ancient word for ones. So these are snake ones, or as a Nephilim, fallen ones, or snake beings is what they're basically saying here. And so when we look at all of this dragon and serpentine imagery that is in all the ancient cultures, on all continents, in all mythologies, and the dragon can't even establish itself through secular history to have even existed, but yet it's in all cultures. And it's matched up with the story of the giants and the flood in pretty much all cultures on all continents around the world, save Antarctica. But the only reason why I say save Antarctica is we don't know what's under the ice or whether or not it was ever not covered with ice. And in the previous age, who knows? Maybe there's some writings there, but I'm going speculative. All continents but Antarctica, to be specific. That is absolutely unaccountable. And so there has to be something going on. And why are all the gods represented as serpent-like beings? And why are all of these beings of serpentine images, whether it's the Egyptian cobra or these serpentine faces that are in Canaanite carvings and inscriptions? We have to understand that these feathered serpents, as they're called in North American, Central American, South American myths, are referring to seraphim angels, just as when they talk about the serpents or the serpent gods of ancient Sumeria and all around the Mediterranean and one presumes around the world, they're talking about the same being that ran these various cult centers.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, when you understand it that way, it unites all of the ancient mysteries, the mythologies, the oral traditions of indigenous native peoples worldwide with the prophetic word and the gospel account of, this ongoing war between these beings, these archonic beings, and humanity.
And they all tell of a rebellion, and they all tell of the flood, and it all goes back to the giants and the corruption of the world, including the humans. And if we just take a back step and understand that whether it's Greek mythology or Atlantean mythology or Sumerian mythology or Chinese mythology or Incan mythology, if we understand the only thing that's really different here is they're telling the same story, but from a polytheist or pagan or multiple god perspective, and from the civilization that had witnessed those same types of events. And if we understand that, we don't have to take their word as gospel, so to speak, but it we can then say, okay, they're telling the same story. How does that match up with the Bible now? Okay, that matches, and that matches, and we get a better understanding what was going on.
Exactly.
And why is that? And the reason why that is so very important is because Jesus said that the end time and his coming will be like the days of Noah. And Genesis is so stingy on its information.
Right. Right. Exactly. Which is why I wanted to study all of the extra biblical texts and all of the ancient mysteries from all these different cultures, and why I spent so much time even studying the Sumerian mythology in order to get further detail on this incredible story that is just, passed over quickly in Genesis. When I first read that the sons of God mating with the daughters of man, creating a race of giants, I was like, wait a second, what? And, wanting to get more and to learn more about that particular story. And then, when I discovered the book of Enoch and other stories like chapter 100, the Kebra Nagast, then I was able to, make sense of how these things connect together with the other oral traditions and the things that are spoken of in these other pagan mythologies. And like you, I was able to bring the underlying truth of all these things together to make a single story and to understand how all of this connected together as truth. And so, um, in your reply, in your next commentary, can you answer? There's a question from the chat room as to whether you believe that the Watchers are still present.
Well, absolutely they are. Not all of them,
Right.
but some of them. And we have to understand that these Watchers were a specific rank of seraphim. So there's several other classifications or ranks of seraphims. But we have, I think, two distinct classes to get specific on the Watchers that were in rebellion and the ones that were working evil in the earth before the flood. So you have the ones that were impassioned, the ones that had sexual relations with human females and created the Nephilim demigods. And so those ones were locked away in the abyss and will be released again in the end time. And so some people say, well, have they been released today? Possibly, but I think if we follow Revelation, probably the keys have not quite been given yet because we're not quite there yet. And it happens in the trumpet sections, which is sort of getting into Revelations by chapter 9. So, but that leaves the ones that were rebelled and were on the earth and were doing evil that weren't put in the abyss. And so perhaps a few more of them, if there was a second incursion after the flood, as a possibility for one way of how the giants may have survived and crossed the flood, would be also in the abyss if that happened. And again, from Gnostic accounts and from other mythologies, that's where you would find some sort of support for a possibility of a second incursion. But that would still leave Watchers and fallen angels who didn't participate before or after the flood with sexual copulation with human females, that they would still be on the loose. And just as important is that if we understand that the first generation of Nephilim were given the immortal spirit, and that's why God limits life to 120 years after this violation against the laws of creation, where you match the spirit of heaven with flesh where it doesn't belong in the physical world and create an immortal spirit, and that he ends that immortality from that point on, is the bodies were still from the physical world, and they died, and some of them even committed suicide, but their spirits wouldn't die, and they weren't permitted to go to sleep, and they're not permitted to go to heaven. And these are the demons that are still affecting the world, and the same demons, at least part of the same demons, because it's a possibility some of these really evil Nephilim their demon spirits may be in the abyss. We're not really given a lot of information on that, but certainly the rest of them are still roaming and doing evil. And when you get into Taoism and into Greek mythology, you hear about this hero worship. And what that is they used to worship the hero that died in their area, because that spirit would come back and he'd be very violent and upset, and they were always trying to appease him with gifts and sacrifices because he had lost his body and he's not permitted into heaven. And when we talk about heroes, that's the same word that's used in Greek mythology as it is in the Bible. Right. And that is not a coincidence. And it's also the same thing that goes on in Taoism. And so we have the worship of these demons ongoing around the world, just as we see some of that in the Bible, that not all the false gods that are being worshipped in biblical history are fallen angels. And the Quran has an interesting point on that it says that when, at the time of the judgment, the fallen angels will say it wasn't us they worshipped, it's the jinn. And there's two different types of jinn in the Quran, but this would be the earthly created jinn, or the gods created from somehow of angels mating with angels to create not a physical human being, but sort of those lower gods in the pantheon that you see in all the other pagan religions of the world. So, because you have demigods, you have these lower gods, and then you have these upper gods, right? So there's a lot of thought out there, and it makes a whole lot of sense to me that if angels can put on a different type of clothing or physical presence in the world of their choosing, and that they can choose their gender, then they could also have procreated between themselves to create the lower level of gods, which explains that pantheon to me.
Yeah, very interesting. When we get back, I'll share with you a small quote from the Colburn Bible, which is talking about the Atlantean age, and also lines with Jeremiah chapter 4, where it speaks of a time when there was not yet man, and yet the cities of the plain had all been destroyed by the fierce judgment of the Lord. All right, we'll be right back, everyone. Welcome back, everybody, for second hour. Gary, I'm going to just share this passage with you really quick. It's from the Colburn Bible. It's called the Scroll of Thothis, and it says this: "The first land on earth wherein men dwelt was not Kaamu. It was a land out beyond the salt waters. To this land came the immortal spirit in the form of a radiant one from heaven, who had left his more enlightened place to dwell among beasts in the lower kingdom of sorrow. In some mysterious way, he became incarnated as man, how we know not, but he founded this early race of man. It is not recorded in tales told for the ignorant." One other thing, too, because this will lead us into some discussion of what I want to cover in this hour. But it says this: "None knows in truth the old motherland or where it was. There are tales, but they disagree. The nine bows say it was southward. The learned are not united in thought. Some say towards the west where the sun now sets, while others say towards the east where the sun rises. Southward are great mountains and forests, monsters, and men covered with hair. Here winds are formed within the earth and issue forth from a black cavern. It is a place of chaos where water, soil, and air are not separate. The old motherland could not have been there. And to the right-hand side is the wide plain of man-eaters, which stretches out to the far reaches. This was barren even in the oldest times. In the north is the land was occupied by deformed men and dwarves, where amid this could have been the fertile pastures and plowlands, well watered from the Sky River." Final passage I want to talk about because it covers the giants. And then we'll go into it. "Beyond the wide river there once was a land graced with all riches needful to men, crowned by many walled Meru, but it was not the land of our birth. and northwards home of the cool breeze, but beyond the lands which skirt the salt water are the one-eyed peoples, and the giants with white hair and eyes. Here the rocks and stones are of the whitest marble, and the trees bear white fruit. And so, anyways, you had mentioned about, them coming down and occupying form, and this passage from the Scroll of Thoth agrees with that. But what is interesting to also in describing the motherland, it describes all these strange beings, dwarves, um, men that were covered with hair, one-eyed giants, which we know them as cyclops in the old mythologies. And so in these ancient times, there's an account like Lord of the Rings, all these different types of human hominids. And I know that in your book and in your studies, you bring forth a lot of information about these fairy, dwarfish, elvish type people and beings. And so, can you comment on that and its connections also to the ancient mythologies and the ancient mysteries?
Yeah, so, when I talk about main themes that sort of run through the book, there's a dragon mythology and there's a fairy mythology, and there's dragon allegories and there's fairy allegories, and they're amazingly sort of connected. One is the following of the patriarchal line, which is the dragon bloodline, and the other one is the matriarchal bloodline, which is the fairy bloodline. And so if people aren't familiar with fairy mythology, well, I guess they probably are, because we get so much brainwashing from the other side, because this is part of their religion, this is part of their history, this is part of their belief system, that before the flood there was a significant amount of beings that aren't here today. And when you mention Lord of the Rings, that's sort of a Norse sort of vernacular and push put on the ancient dwarf and elf and fairy mythology. And at the end of the Lord of the Rings, you see all of these beings, and they go away on this boat on water, which is representative of the flood, because from that point on is the time of man. And so they're recording their history and their genealogies and their religion through these types of tales, because they believe in the polytheist religions that all of these beings were around before the flood. And to some extent, within the smaller areas of some of these religions and organizations, they believe that they still exist, whether they're coming through portals or wherever, or amongst us, or have the ability to go from dimensions, however you want to look at that. But that's part of their belief system as well. So it gives people an idea about fairies. There are 4 different classes of fairies. And there are fallen angels, the ones that came from the other planets in the fairy mythos. And these are the rebellious ones, and led by the proud angel, which is just another telling of the Luciferian, or I hate to use that word because Lucifer is only used once in one Bible or 2 Bibles of Vulgate. Jerome uses it as well. But whether it's Bel-El or Satan, as he's more commonly known and called throughout the Bible, they weren't permitted to have their own universe that they were rebelling to have in fairy mythology. And then they created the earthborn fairies, which were the Nephilim in the fairy account. And the most notable of those ones, of those shining earthborn ones, are the Tuatha De Danann, which played a significant role with my book, and with the elven race of the shining ones, which is the elf race, as that allegory goes. You also have the daemons, which are the spirit bodiless ones, which are obviously the demigods that died out. Their bodies died out, but they still roam the earth. And then you've got the 4th classification called the elementals, and these are the little people. And in fairy mythology, there's 3 classifications in the little people. There's the gnomes and the goblins, and they're ugly. And gnomes are one of those root words for gnosis and guarding the knowledge, because that was one of the commissions of the gnomes and the goblins, was to guard the archives and the knowledge and the treasures and the technology of the information. And then you also have the mischievous ones like the leprechauns, and then you also have the little people, which are the really good-looking ones, and you might see some of those ones like in Peter Pan, which is another interesting rabbit trail to go down if you ever want to talk about, the god Pan and how the fairy allegory is encoded with the same ancient sort of mythos. And also, when I talk about fairies in the book, as I said, I'm going to talk about the elven race of shining ones, the Tuatha De Danann. I'm going to talk about the pharaoh kingships in the book, which it comes from the ancient root as Phare and Pharo, so pharaoh, faray, fairy, so the root word for fairy in some of their belief systems. I'm going to talk about the matriarchal succession of the dragon bloodline that exists today, that goes back to Tiamat and Lilith. And Tiamat is another name for what monotheists might know as Leviathan. And of course, Lilith is a very famous demon god of ancient Sumerian history, which is very much celebrated these days, but they don't really understand the roots of this blood-sucking demon that has so many other aspects to it, which is another rabbit trail to go down. And there's also the fairy bloodline of the Grail Queen, which is, again, following the bloodline of the Grail womb and the V and the Graal and the Holy Grail tales that were created by the Knights Templar that I'll talk about again. So more allegories into this fairy mythology. And then you've got sort of the elven religious aspect of the Gnostics, and they believe in the Albigens, and just as the Cathars did, and the Mary Magdalene bloodline, and marrying in with these Nephilim matriarchal bloodlines. That's also part of the fairy mythos. And then you also have the fair Celt, which comes from the Trojan area, and where giants existed, also known as Scythians and Sarmatians, and both the Scythians and the Sarmatians, who are connected to the Tuatha De Danann as giants, they were known as the snake and the dragon people. So that's where that starts to come back as you go back into prehistory of how dragon and fairy will partake. And one example of the little people that guard the knowledge of the gnomes that we see in a modern mythos more for our times and technology is one interesting little gnome group that has flying machines and technology and great knowledge, and they kidnap people, and they're trying to modify DNA, they're trying to reproduce, they're trying to inject new life into their DNA and bloodlines, and they kidnap people and then they return them, and they have no memory of it, is the gray neighbors, as they're called, or the grays. And I have a description of a fairy abduction that if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you'd swear it was the gray alien abduction. And so my whole point on this is that there is a whole history that polytheism believes and have kept records and keep alive today that brainwashes our society, along with superheroes, which goes back to the heroes of old and Nephilim, and so much more that is constant brainwashing and keeping track of their history and their genealogies right in front of our eyes, also in preparation for having people more easily accept these concepts and the great delusions that are coming in the end time. So that's a pretty big area of the fairies, and the little people that you were talking about in Tolkien and in the other account of the Bible. I'm not sure which Bible that was, the Colburn Bible, I think.
Yeah, the Colburn. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where the account of that is that it's my conclusion that these things occurred because the technology that took place before the flood, they created a society of technology that, in my opinion, and they did this through the development of the seven sciences and the additional information given to them by the Watchers, a level that was as great as our society or more. And they created all sorts of beings, not just beings that were created from the copulation of these Watchers and angels with human females, but as you mentioned, things like Cyclops. But if you get into the mythologies, there's like Pegasus, there's centaurs,
Right.
and the centaurs created in a cloud, which sort of brings a whole bunch of other sort of connotations to mind. But there's all of these fantastic beings that somehow they had the ability to manipulate DNA and create different species, where you have a chimera where you've got like I think a serpent and a lion, and I can't remember the other animal that's part of the chimera, but they're able to crossbreed and create these fantastic individuals. And if you look at what some of those dwarves, and in particularly these gray gnomes and goblins look like, I mean, there's a bit of a serpentine sort of look to that. So I wonder whether or not those were DNA manipulations or other forms of procreation through whether it's either animals or other humans that created the little people as well. So I think all of that is very likely to have happened, and I think that also answers, in partnership with demons and fallen angels, to this whole alien mythos that is going on. Because again, when you get into fairy mythology, you understand that they talk about portals to another world or another dimension all of the time, whether or not it's in Peter Pan or they're going to Neverland. That's just another name for Otherworld or Netherworld or Anne Wynne. But if you talk about fairy mythology, it's the fairy shays, S-I-D-H-E. It's pronounced different than what it's spelled, and those are portals. And in the Grail mythologies, the ladies of the lake are guarding these shays, these portals to other worlds. Like, it's absolutely everywhere, this mythology of portals and fairies and little people, and somehow working with these rebellious fallen angels, and also connected and working side by side with these Nephilim kings and bloodlines throughout history. So it's a very, very rich sort of new kind of history, if you want to look at it that perspective from what has been revealed to us. But there's just so much of it out there that I think a lot of it probably was true. And again, I go back to saying, well, how do we know that from the Bible? Well, I mean, we have to go back to what Jesus said. The end times are going to be like the days of Noah.
Right.
Not only before the flood, but Noah lived after the flood. So right up to the time of Sodom and Gomorrah and Babel. And so whatever was going on there, we need to understand better, because that's what we're going to see in the end time. And lo and behold, we have the alien mythos that's on us today, right? And I believe they're connected.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm in full agreement. And like, when you look at books like the Book of Giants, where it speaks about the miscegenation and the corruption of the genetics of both the plants and creatures, we see that same kind of thing ongoing now with the genetically modified crops and the introduction of animal genes into plants. I mean, the mixing, it's all being repeated. And so, yes, we are as in the days of Noah. All those references, which to me is just confirmation that indeed we are living in the end of days, and that we are the final generation, and that as it says with the blooming of the fig tree in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, that all these things will unfold for this generation that is alive during the time of the blooming of the fig tree, which I take to be the recreation of the nation state of Israel, which happened in 1948. And so, yeah, we're going to absolutely see all these things, and which in my mind is also reason why the Most High is bringing out these huge revelations because the Spirit is being poured out on the flesh. And we are to know, those of us that are truth seekers and that want to understand the real history of, what has occurred even in the pre-Adamic, pre-Diluvian, prior times, Zep-Tepe age, when the fallen angels were here and ruling. And, I know there's a lot of people that deny that there was this, the gap theory, or that there was this prior times, but how would you explain there being cities like Yanaguni and Dwarka,
Yeah.
entire huge megalithic structures and complexes built and lying at the bottom of the oceans? I mean, all of
And
that. Go ahead.
unaccounted for from a civilization perspective, right? There's no intelligent answer given for these cities that go way back in time in terms of their history and who occupied them, if you just go by
Exactly.
standard secular history.
Right, right. Yeah, because these things were done, at a time when we're supposedly hunter and gatherers and did not have any kind of technology to replicate or to even now construct in similar manner the megalithic type complexes which the fallen angels, in my opinion, did in the pre-Diluvian age. And so, yeah, all of those are confirmation as to the veracity of the mythology that we see being repeated worldwide, which points, at these feathered serpents and all of these other hominid type races as actually being present in history. And we know that because they are hybrid beings, a lot of them, they weren't able to copulate and replicate themselves. And that's why we see quick references of them and then a lot of them just disappearing out of history.
Yes. And when we talk about the corruption of that antediluvian world, which is going to happen in our time, is it's not just that the people were corrupt and violent. The whole world is corrupted, as you were talking about. Whether it doesn't matter whether it's plants or it's animals, all beings were corrupted. And I think what it's saying about that is DNA corruption. Like nothing was pure anymore. It was just all taken away from the author of that creation because it was perverted. And that's what's is happening as we see it unfolding in our lifetime is any answer other than it is done by God is seemingly acceptable.
Right,
It doesn't have to make any sense.
right, right. And, I also think that part of the whole the push to assert that the ancient aliens are our creators is part of the next facet of the strong delusion, and the whole
Mm.
conspiracy as far as the agenda of the New World Order in bringing forth Antichrist and having the world bow to him and accept him as being God.
Yeah, again, I look at the ancient alien theory as just being, a modern mythology on what happened in prehistory and what's going on today for our technology, advanced civilization today, where it's easier to accept that it wasn't a god, it was just a very advanced alien. Well,
Right,
all they've done is they've sliced a higher intelligence a little bit differently, but made it acceptable and digestible for our arrogance and our civilization. But they're telling the same story. They're just taking it away from what actually had happened so that they can deceive people. Eventually, in the end time, people are going to find out these weren't the ancient aliens. These were these super beings. These were the angels, and that were doing all of this.
right,
And the different creatures that they created that work for them are some of these things that they're sort of showing us today. Whether it's the little grays or the other types of aliens that seem to be coming out in these sightings and things. And I'm not putting credence to all of this, all of the UFO mythology. But what I do know is there's way too much of that going on that is completely identical to the fairy mythology
right.
to be a coincidence.
Right. And, for people to deny that it's part of what's going on in the world. I mean, there's just too much of it, and whether it's somewhat military and government, as far as the black op world, and the other side of it with being ongoing of like, they say that maybe some people say that there were no further incursions, but in my mind, those kind of things are still ongoing because they are still taking seed from men, male people that are being abducted, and also taking pregnancies from women that often they are only being allowed to be pregnant for a certain period of time, and then their children are being taken from them. And in my mind, that's a continuation of the incursion of the rebel angels, the fallen watchers, and also the whole aspect of the fairy abduction of children and the monitoring of seed, the experimentation and the genomic experiments with creating hybrid beings, and so all of that is still ongoing, and so really there are still incursions happening even to this day and age.
Yeah, so whether or not, I mean, to roll forward and then roll backwards again, whether or not we're going to see actual copulations with human beings to create these great giant demigods that we saw before the flood, or it's the bloodlines or the descendants, or it's DNA manipulation, or it is transhumanism, or it's the new man concept with genetics that the Nazis did, which is, again, the same belief system. We are going to see a Nephilim-type effects in the end time, and we're seeing all of those different aspects of it. It's just that the giant one gets all the attention, right? But in the end, in before the flood, if we accept the other stories that of what happened in the flood, all of these other things went on as well, and they were all
Right.
part of that sort of Nephilim new man, destroy and corrupt the earth completely philosophy. And there's always been this sort of push from polytheism to develop superhumans, right? And they
Yes.
continue and continue and continue. It's part of their religion. It's part of them wanting to bring about the end time. It's part of their evolution that they believe that's going to turn them into gods, that started with the serpent and Satan deceiving Adam and Eve in Eden, saying through knowledge you can be like gods.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Gary, we've got a few questions from the chat room. I know we're almost to
Mm-hmm.
break, but they wanted to ask you about CERN, and do you think that the fallen angels um, have been doing this in order to release the angels from the abyss or to prepare for that time?
Well, there's certainly a lot of speculation that CERN is trying to create this portal to another dimension, but I'm not convinced that they have to do that to release the angels from the abyss. If you look at what happens, there's a special shaft and location for them to be released in the end time, and there's all these other abilities to do portals, whether it's on pyramids or between the pillars of Bel, and all these fairy domain portals. That it's not about portals; it's something more sinister.
All right, welcome everybody back for a final segment. I want to give you a chance to finish up your thought there, Gary, and then there's a couple more questions from the chat room.
Yeah, so I think as I was almost finishing on that before the break, is it's more, I think, designed that they're trying to break into the shaft of the abyss. And I think people need to realize that there's an abyss of fire that's going to be used for judgment, and there's also a shaft that seems to be right beside it. And whether or not it's in the universe somewhere or it's in the earth, I believe that they're trying to, I think they believe they know where the abyss is, and I believe they're trying to design something to break in and break these impassioned angels and the worst of the demons out before their time. But I don't think that they'll actually be able to do that. But it's interesting, though, when you get into Revelation that when that does happen, a star falls from heaven with the keys to the abyss. So one wonders whether or not that's an analogy of a fallen angel.
I absolutely
But
believe so.
yeah. So, but to me, the trouble is with the whole CERN thing is we just don't know. It's all speculation. So, some interesting theories, but to create portals, I'm not convinced they need to CERN for creating portals. I think they have that already in their religions and in their belief systems. So.
Question from Matthew. Do you have any comment as to the apparent satanic ritual that took place in the Gothard Tunnel recently? I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I saw some things on that. I mean, I'm taking it that a ritual was actually done. I think it's just more arrogance. I think it was done
Right.
in that people, for the most part, will say, well, that wasn't that just fun and entertaining. But I mean, they're just boasting their technology, they're boasting their religion, and not honoring the God of the universe, where all of this is, permitted and where knowledge comes from. So it's just what they do. So I don't find it all that newsworthy. I think it's getting to be more and more in your face these
Yes.
days, and that would be one classic example of it. But it's just more of the same.
Right. And they're not trying to hide anything, and you're right. It is all in your face. They don't care anymore. I mean, they used to be a little bit more subtle before, but I
Yeah.
think that, with where we are now and the hour being so late, they have no regard, no concern for trying to be any kind of deceptive at all. It's just all in your face. But
Well,
another,
except for
go ahead.
the naysaying Christians, they've prepared everybody to say, "Yeah, isn't that
Right.
cool?"
Right. Um, Another question. Do you know anything about the black-eyed children or have comment?
That's kind of died from the popularity that was out there. Uh, yeah, I didn't spend a lot of time researching the black-eyed children. I read a few things on it. I think it's interesting, and I'm not sure why we're not hearing more of it right now. So maybe you've got some thoughts on that, Zen, as to why that's kind of gone away or at least been de-emphasized.
I'm not exactly sure. I haven't really even researched it, probably not even as much as you have, so I really can't, comment or speculate. But I did, I do understand that there have been meetings with these kind of black-eyed children, and they, must be
Yep.
some kind of demonic entity. But to me, it's just showing that the veil is thinning, and we're having this overlap between spiritual and physical world, and that we're going to be increasingly witness to more and more weirdness and strange
Yep.
spiritual phenomena um, as we
Yeah.
go more and more in the end of days.
Yep. Yeah, I agree, and I looked at the black-eyed children as just sort of one of these additional corruptions to the DNA and
Right.
hybrid type of things. So, yeah, and again, I found the black eye thing interesting, but I wasn't. The reason why it didn't excite me a whole bunch is okay, so it's just another application of the same principle. So okay, so what, right? Unless there was going to be like armies of these things all over the place, it wasn't really catching my imagination.
hmm Yeah, and I'm sure that you're so focused on your research and that you keep finding more and more discoveries, just like what we were talking about with the book. At some point, you really have to abandon it as project, and just decide to release it and let it go, because otherwise it would be ongoing forever.
Yeah, and you can't remember everything anyways.
Right, right, right.
So yeah, there's just so many rabbit holes. So
Yeah. before we go into the next topic of where I want to take the show, I want to ask you, do you have any kind of thoughts on a follow-up or any books that you've, because I'm sure you have a bunch of research you've already compiled into different, outlines and different things you want to follow up on and study and research, but anything in particular that makes you want to put forth effort and bring it into book form?
Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to bring thought-provoking and new information and tie more things together than people thought was possible before. And so I've got another book underway. It's going to be a while getting it done, especially with being so busy in promoting my current book. But I'm probably unedited. I'm like 300 pages into it, and I want to keep it under 500 pages. So
Excellent.
I have some work to cut it back. But what it is it's going to start with the Holy Covenant and the time of the Nephilim that are around there. So it sort of starts there, but it's going to go in a different direction. And what I'm going to deal with is the Holy Covenant of Israel, the lost tribes, the curses of the covenant and the blessings of the covenant, and bring that through to end time prophecy in the awakening of the lost tribes and the second Exodus. So it's and if I can mix enough history and mythology in it like I did this time, but keep it shorter, that's kind of what I'm going to try and do with it.
Excellent. Because I know in this book too that you, like I do in my work, you show the differentiation between the children of perdition and the children of promise, and you follow up this because this theme is interwoven throughout Scripture. The entire biblical narrative, it talks about this ongoing enmity and war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and its connections even to the return of Christ, the second coming, and how then the harvest will be gathered, the wheat for preservation and the tares for burning. And so we see this theme repeated throughout the entire discourse of the gospel account.
Yeah, and it's different than just people who are following, evil in a different way. It's when it says, the seed of the serpent is going, to bite at the heel of the descendants of Eve. That's not an allegorical statement. I mean, that is saying that there is a race, a bloodline, a people, however you want to, move off into an interpretation of that. But generally, it's just descendants, right? And that they are going to be at odds with the people who follow God's laws and ways and the Adamites right throughout our history. And so we should see that all through our history, and we should see that today, and we should see that happening in the end time, because that's what it says.
Yeah, well, you know that my take is that there absolutely is a difference between Cain and his bloodline, and that it all goes back to Eve's beguilement, her eating fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That when you look up terms like fruit and tree, eat, seed, that they all have connections to progeny, generations, offspring, to semen, to sperm, and that there's sexual connotation associated all that. And so I, literally believe that there is absolutely a physical bloodline that is connected to the serpent, and that they are working in the background, in the shadows, waging war against the sons of Adam, and that these are the lineages and the descendants that are connected to New World Order. Comment?
Yeah, for me, I'm a bit agnostic on that, but I do cover it off in my book towards the end of the book, so I don't ignore it. For me, and I'll come back to there is a connection where I can make a firm connection in the Bible, but it's a little bit tenuous, so I leave that open. But at the end of the day, whether or not the serpent seed is just coming from Genesis 6 or the serpent seed is coming from Cain and Genesis 6. I'm fine with that, and I'm fine if Cain isn't a serpent seed and he's just evil and following Satan, and we still have the Genesis 6 seed. So I'm a little bit that point doesn't really. I don't live and die on that point, but all I could find in the Bible without getting into allegory is that in Genesis 4:1. It's interesting to note when you look at the name of Cain, that sounds like the ancient Hebrew word for acquired.
Yes,
And
exactly.
secondly, in some in translations just behind after it says Cain in 4:1, it says when the Lord brought forth a man, and that could also be translated as acquired. So that would be the only sort of literal sort of connection I could make for that. So it's there. I don't know whether he is or he isn't, but I certainly know in other traditions and certainly parts of Jewish writings it is, and certainly in Jewish mysticism that's the case, and in the other Gnostic Gospels they believe that Cain was either the son of Eve and Satan, or Lilith and Satan, or Eve being raped by one of several of the celestial mafia to produce Cain, and that Cain was of a different seed and a demigod. But the Gnostics, as I say, they've got so many different versions, it's hard to know which one that they're actually referring to. So there is material out there that suggests that is the case, and there is this connection in 4:1. But I haven't seen enough to for my own perspective. I haven't seen enough to conclude definitely that that's the case. But I'm certainly not denying it, because I know those connections are there.
Yeah. Well, have you had a chance at all to read any of the Targum that I sent you?
I did. I started on it. I'm still working my way through it, and you do present a very, very good case for it. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, those are very interesting texts and very interesting reading. And again, they go back to like first century CE, after the Israelites came back from their exile, and so they're like 1,500 years, and there being the Aramaic translations of the original Hebrew Torah, and 1,500 years prior to the King James. It's interesting study to look at, and to look through the additional commentary and the detail that is found within them.
And the other thing is and I'll also allude to it in the book is that when you get into Genesis 5, because I did have a hard look at this, but unfortunately, and maybe I haven't gone deep enough yet on it. I find it odd that when we have a recanting of the genealogy, that it says, and maybe I've got the verse wrong with Genesis 5, but I mean, when we're talking about Seth, it was in the likeness of Adam.
Right.
Like,
And
why
then
say that?
similitude. Right, exactly, yeah.
And because you would assume he'd have some resemblance to Adam, but because the Bible doesn't just put words in there for no reason.
Exactly.
There's a purpose for that.
Exactly.
So it's trying to say that there was either something different about Cain than Seth. But also in the Gnostic Gospels, there's some traditions there that Abel was also acquired and was also the seed of angels. So, and in other ones they have that he was the son of Eve. So, it's Gnostic and mysticism. They're not always consistent. So, but it's interesting that there's a few lines that I found in Genesis that I kind of struggled with, and so I do cover all of those theories off in my book. I just don't answer it because I'm just not quite sure on that one.
Yeah. Well, wait till you get to Genesis 5 in the Targums. it will absolutely affirm, what you're talking about as far as the differences in the similitude and likeness, and also will help you to understand, because in the Targums it says that the portion that is left out of the King James verse is that she desired the angel, and then that's what led to the conception of Cain, and so, which in my mind makes sense that if he is the son of the devil, that is why he would be evil and a murderer, liar, and a deceiver when both Adam and Eve are not. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, would certainly make that case, no doubt about it, and why he would go sideways so quickly.
right, exactly. And also, if you consider that if Genesis 4:1 is actually alluding to Cain being the child of the devil, it makes sense that that passage is located in the beginning of chapter 4, where you have Cain's lineage being presented in fullness and Adam's lineage being separated and then cited in Genesis chapter 5.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting, again, what's left out in 5 is, it's got from Adam to Noah, but no mention of Cain.
Right, exactly. And also in Christ's
Again,
lineage in Luke, chapter 3, verse 25 through 38, I believe it is. It goes from Adam as being God's son to Seth, and because Abel was murdered and Cain wasn't a child of Adam's, he's left out of Christ's
yeah,
lineage.
yep.
But anyways, we've got just a little bit of time remaining, so I want to give you a chance to give out your website contact and where people can go to find your book, any websites that you want to mention, and then we'll get into final commentary.
Okay. Yes, you can get my book through my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. And go to the Buy Now section and then Buy from Author. And you can also email me off that website, and I'm sure I respond to your email. I respond to all the emails that come in. And you can, and if anybody was wanting, what I was talking about on the difference between Day 6 and the Eden account, just email me and I'll send you a copy of that. It's about just over 2 pages, point by point. You can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63 and Facebook as well. You can contact me there under Gary Wayne, and my book is also available through Amazon around the world, BarnesandNoble.com, through most bookstores. If they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it, and through Christian bookstores as well, as it's distributed through Send the Light Distribution. So I do try and get back to everybody who contacts me, so feel free to get a hold of me or friend me on Facebook.
Also, want the listening audience to know that Gary is going to join us for a series of shows, and that's why we began this evening with the War in Heaven and the pre-Antediluvian age, because I want to give him enough time to go from the beginning to the end, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for a number of shows so that we can actually do that, Gary, because your work is so extensive and so detailed and so very elaborate that I want to, give you the platform to cover it and not just kind of rehash the main concepts and the talking points, so to speak, that you share with most other shows if you're only doing 1 or 2 episodes.
Yeah, it's so hard to cover the whole book because there's just so many things in it. And there's 98 chapters in the book, plus an epilogue and a preface. But each chapter is a little mini story, so that you don't have to try and read it all at once. And you can't, because there's that much information in there that I think your brain cells will start to pop after reading too many chapters if you're trying to speed read it. So you can read it and come back, and everything will keep coming up in the book as the book continues to unfold. So if you wanted to go back and reread the chapter, it's easy to do that as well. So, but it's amazing what I tell people who are reading the book. If you think the first section has a lot of information, it doesn't stop coming at you right through to the last chapter. You are going to get more information than you ever thought possible.
Yeah, it seems to have presented itself that way in what I have already read. But in the last bit of time that we have remaining, can you share with us a couple of interesting stories that you learned in your research that you might that the listening audience might find fascinating? And then we'll end with final commentary, whatever you want to say in closing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I learned coming through, but just I guess the thing that really sort of grabbed me is how the dragon and the fairy imagery and iconology and mythos is connected, and it goes all the way back to prehistory. And it's so ever present in our day, and that it just sort of unfolds so much of what we see. It starts, it's in entertainment because it started in the ancient classics of the writings where they started to keep this, and it kept coming through the ages, right through to Shakespeare. He writes about the same things, and right through to Walt Disney, for crying out loud.
Right.
It's just it's just absolutely everywhere, and the vampire thing that has really just become so huge. It's all part of this dragon side of the allegories. Yes. And I'll connect all of that on the book. So I guess that's what really surprised me was learning about this, because I was oblivious to this allegory and symbolism that they were bombarding us with, day in and day out. It was like, how could I have been that much asleep?
Yeah, it's amazing when you learn the truth about what has really gone on here and what has unfolded over all the eras and epochs of even before humanity. I mean, it's just the story is the most amazing, most intricate, and most mind-blowing that could ever even be imagined or conceived. And it's the reality. I mean, it's just wow.
And then the second biggest thing that I think astonished me very early on, which is sort of changed the direction from just a prophecy thing into more of a conspiracy book, was learning that these secret organizations, and Freemasonry in particular, even though that's not the highest of the organizations, have all of these legends and beliefs that take them right back to the time of Enoch, son of Cain, and their descendants, and the development of the seven sciences, and that Masonry is another name for geometry as the fifth science, and their organization begat with that Sabaism, sun worship, at the time of the Nephilim, and they partnered, and that people like Nimrod were also great patriarchs, along with Tubal-Cain in Freemasonry, and others like Lamech and Nama, but that Nimrod was the first Grand Master of the post-Diluvian epoch for building the first ziggurat of the post-Diluvian world at Babel, and all of a sudden that story comes together. I'm going, that just kind of blew me away, that these secret societies were that old and have been working against us that long. And even to the point where it gets into the modern age, where you get into the King James Bible, which I know is a very, very good Bible, but it was helped, guided, and certainly worked through from the background of these secret societies, because they wanted a transition from the old oral charges to a written one, and they have an extended Bible that they use off of the King James Bible that they use at the adept level. And it's so the ones that you get at the lower level is pretty much the same as what you get of a normal King James version. But although these organizations have done some good things, like doing the King James Bible, they used it for a whole different reason, and they're going to use that Bible and that extended Bible from their Polychronicon that they've added to that in the end time, and they're going to change their knowledge of that and the creation of the modern Bible, for at least for the West, to an allegorical interpretation in the end times, and it's just mind-boggling, some of this stuff.
Gary, it's been a pleasure. I have so much that I still want to talk to you about. I look forward to our further discourse.
Terrific. It's been terrific being with you.